And now, from the great state of Mississauga in Ontario, Canada, it's the Ted Wallachin Podcast. Brought to you by Tom's Place. For the finest in men's fashion, Tom's Place will suit you. And ETP Canada, providing estate administration with ease. ETP Canada. And now, here's Ted.
Thanks so much, Becky, and welcome everyone. Our special guest this week is author Kenneth Womack. Mr. Womack is, in fact, a world-renowned authority on the Beatles. He has written a 2-volume biography on Beatles producer George Martin, plus some 5 other books on the Beatles. Those books are included, in fact, in the permanent collection of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame Library and Archives. His latest offering is titled Living the Beatles Legend, the Untold Story of Mal Evans. Who is Mal Evans, you may ask? Some of you may know, most of you don't. Mal Evans first met the Beatles when he was a bouncer at the famous Cavern Club. From there, he became the Beatles' roadie, personal assistant, and really a devoted friend. He was a big part of the Beatles' lives from the beginning right until they closed the book on the Beatles. It's a fascinating story, and I think that you'll enjoy listening to this interview. So here we go, Kenneth Womack, Living the Beatles Legend, the Untold Story of Mal Evans. Kenneth, it's nice to meet you. I appreciate you taking the time. How are you?
Oh, thank you so much for speaking with me today. Doing great out here on the shore, which is becoming colder by the moment.
Yes, I can understand that. Here in Toronto, it's much the same situation. We go from a lovely day that feels like springtime to the next thing it feels like the end of November. However, tis what it is. By the way, congratulations! It's a fabulous book. It's parts of it you read it and you think to yourself, this is like a film that somebody made up. And this is like, I mean, not only is this character, Mal Evans, someone that, you know, unless you're a devout Beatle fan, you would never have heard of. But then when you get to know who he is, you think to yourself, okay, I tried to explain to a friend of mine as I was reading the book. He said, well, who was he? What was his role? Was he like the roadie or something? And I said, well, it started that way, but to say at the end that he was calling him a roadie would be like calling the Beatles a bar band.
That's right. There are other dimensions.
Yeah, a lot of dimensions to him. And so I'm reading along in the book and I'm thinking like, wow, these stories are they're so fascinating. And here it is. It's about a group that I grew up with and I remember watching as a young kid right until the end of their career and not knowing that any of this was going on.
Yeah, and that's the element that's interesting, right? Is when you read a book, not just this one, but many works about history where you're pulling back the curtain a little bit, but things are also not settled questions, right?
Yeah.
You know, when the Beatles are on their way, but there's no telling whether or not they'll be a success.
Yeah, and not only is it a story of a fascinating man, and it's fascinating. It's a fascinating character. It's a fascinating story. And on top of that, it's also one of those stories where people think I have a better understanding now of this group that I grew up and I loved and the dynamics between, because you hear so many stories about how they got along, how they didn't get along, and he was one of those individuals who got along with all 4 of them equally.
That's right, and not just the 4 Beatles, but everybody. In fact, the only people he would not get along with would be ones with evil in their hearts.
Yeah. Now, to paint a picture of Mal, he was 6'3". Now, back in the 60s, 6'3" was a pretty imposing figure. And he was a strong man, and he was an imposing figure, but at the very heart of him, he was like a teddy bear.
He really was. And in fact, as you know from reading the book, one of the things he worried about was folks figuring out that, you know, despite his size, he really was just more likely to cuddle with you than, you know, take you on physically.
Yeah. So even though he didn't want people to know that he wasn't this big, tough guy, he wouldn't let anything stand in the way of the needs and the wants of the 4 lads. That whatever they needed to be done, to be considered he was there for him, and nothing was going to stop his mission.
That's absolutely right. As non-imposing as he could be, he would never let anything get between himself and the Beatles. And if any incident had really occurred during their time together, you can bet your bottom dollar he would have been right there facing off with anybody. In fact, he does get in exactly one fist fight at the Olympia Theater in January 1963. But otherwise, his goal is to satisfy their every need, to anticipate them at times, like Radar O'Reilly, and Mal absolutely exists that way.
Yeah. So not only is this a fascinating story, the story of how it became a book is quite fascinating in itself. Just to give people a bit of a backgrounder here, Mal was a bouncer at the Cavern Club where the Beatles were appearing, and got called upon to drive them to a gig one evening because their driver got sick. That's basically how it began, correct?
Yeah, so he'd known him at that point, I guess, about at least maybe 14 months, but he'd been a bouncer before then. But that night in January 1963, it was January 1963, when they were on their way back from London from that first big promotional push for Please Please Me, which obviously was a successful one. The windscreen cracked in a driving snowstorm. Cab of the van was filling up, and Mal broke out the rest of the glass. John Lennon wrapped him in scarves and a bag with eye holes for his eyes. And they rode through the night in that fashion. The Beatles were stacked in the back like a Beatles sandwich, Paul McCartney said, with a big bottle of hooch between them. And the whole way back, they would say, "How far to go?" And Mal would say, 200 miles to go, whether they were 10 miles or 150.
Right.
And that became their mantra. When they'd get in trouble saying Manila, it would be 200 miles to go.
And so they convinced him to come and join him on a full-time basis. Was that a difficult task, do you think?
It was very difficult on Mal's end because he had a full-time job. He had a pension, really a very nice middle-class existence, a home, a car. He was way ahead of most folks on the social curve in post-war England. But he didn't want to resist that. And in fact, his whole family came after him. But the one person who supported him would be Lily, his wife.
Yeah. And of course, at this point, nobody has any idea of how well the Beatles are going to do. And there have been so many stories of bands that have had the one-hit wonders. They start off hot as a flame, and then, boy, next thing you know, you don't even know where they are. And
That's right. And
selling insurance.
They could have easily been that band. This is before She Loves You has run away with the charts. They haven't proven themselves really, other than Please Please Me and From Me to You. And, his family rightly believes that, this is a fad. And they're right. I mean, everything else, right, had been a fad. Why wouldn't this be one, too? Why wouldn't rock and pop just be something that we go through very quickly as a culture and then spit right back out?
Well, it reminds me of when I saw the Beatles on Ed Sullivan. When I'm watching my brother and my mother and I, and my mother says, "This is just a passing fad. They won't even be around in 6 months." And up until my mother's demise in her late 80s, I kept reminding her every once in a while, "How about that Beatles prediction of yours, Mom?"
That's right. They're half dead, right? And they have a number one song, or it did last week in the UK.
Yeah. So during the course of his time, Mal's time with the Beatles, he's taking notes. He's doing sketches. He's doing all kinds of things. He's taking photographs. He's keeping several diaries, is what he's doing. And then eventually he decides, okay, you know what? I'm going to sit down. I'm going to turn this into a memoir. And this is 1975.
That's right. He had really gotten to the point where maybe even to expiate himself of his Beatle years, because he had other ambitions, such as being a producer or a songwriter. And it was his girlfriend who really helped him out, Fran Hughes. And he began to put together this production. And Mal wrote it. He had he hired a stenographer and had a friend who was going to handle the art for him. Particularly the making of those photographs into negatives so he could ship them off to the press. Mal had a whole plan ready. And in about 20 sessions, he read the materials to Joanne Leonard, who was the stenographer, and almost verbatim, the book reads exactly like his recordings do in those steno books.
Mm-hmm. And so at one point it all comes to an end, and there's all these notes sitting around and the beginnings of a memoir that are now in a position of a publishing company that do not want to release them to the family.
Yeah, so this is where it gets dicey. And the issue was that the book, despite what we've been reading all these years, was completed. It needed some additional, just a little bit of copy work to get it done, but it was essentially completed. They had paid him in advance, of course, a pretty healthy one for that time. And while insurance would enable them to get some of that back, they wanted to make good on their production and get it out there. And the family was understandably distraught. Here's their dad and husband living with another woman in another country. It's going to take some mourning, going to take some time, and what they needed to do was create a positive relationship with the family, get those materials to them, and begin moving forward. Instead, they kind of, without saying it necessarily, held them hostage, and this went on until the late 1970s. Mal's killed on January 4th, 1976. So that was allowed to go on for the rest of the decade, and as we know, into the next. And we wouldn't know about these materials, or the family probably wouldn't have them, except for a publishing temp rather, in 1988, who found them when they were cleaning out the Grosset and Dunlap building because they'd been purchased by Putnams.
His son Gary, when talking of his father's passing, characterizes it by saying, quote, "He orchestrated his own demise." Explain that.
Well, Mal essentially committed suicide by cop. Of course, we didn't have that phrase then. And what essentially had happened was, and like with most suicides, right, he was keeping this a secret. He had been thinking for some time about it. There were clues telling his one of his friends and family, while he was sitting around watching Gunsmoke, that he wanted to go out in a hail of bullets. Seemed like not much, but it turns out that was true. He had been doing things like showing them how to winterize the duplex, etc. There are a lot of telltale signs that only make sense in retrospect. But one thing, of course, the world didn't know until this book was that he'd written his last will and testament the night before, and that's usually a pretty good sign that they have something's expected the next day. And poor old Fran, who's a wonderful, wonderful person, and just was such a generous help with this book. When she, when she woke up the next day, things seemed okay. She thought they were past everything. They were putting away the Christmas tree. And then sometime that afternoon, Mal set his plan into action. The cops came as he wished. And when they came upstairs, he pointed the gun at them. And cops did what cops do.
Yeah. It's terrible. The book itself, how did you come to be a part of it?
At the beginning of COVID, when we were all in our lockdown phase that I know you remember so well.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, that's right. What happened was Gary Evans got in touch with me through a mutual friend and said, "Hey, can you help me out with this? I've been trying to tell this story. I feel like I'm ready now. What can we do to bring this to pass?" And I knew within minutes of talking to him, liking him so much, that I'd do whatever he wanted. It wasn't going to be a big issue to me. He's just such a splendid person. But I did say, I got to see the stuff to see what I can really do here. And when I did get it, it blew my mind. And I realized that this was much larger than just some simple 80,000 words character sketch, that this was a much more complex person than I'd ever realized.
Yeah. He was, as you mentioned briefly, Ken, Mal was a lot more things than just I guess you'd call him sort of a personal assistant today in today's show business vernacular. He was a songwriter. He was a producer. He produced for Badfinger, which was a group many people remember had a couple of hits, and they were mentored by the Beatles to a certain degree, I guess, by Paul McCartney more so, if I'm right.
Yeah, very
He was
briefly,
an
Paul
artist.
worked with them. Mal's song, of course, that he produced was "No Matter What," which may be their most well-known song.
Yeah, a huge hit. And he wanted to take on a larger role. I mean, he was involved in the recording sessions. He was involved in. I mean, there's a sketch of the Beatles. The iconic cover of Abbey Road as they're walking across Abbey Road. And was he responsible for the actual cover itself?
No, Paul had come up with that idea. Mal was simply pulling it off. His job was to be he would stage manage things. That's the term I've kind of coined for this. He would be the guy who, made sure that all the parts were running well and smoothly. The photographer shows up when they're supposed to, all that good stuff. So that was Mal's job, was making sure all those pieces were in place and ready to go.
Oftentimes in the entertainment industry, those people who work around the stars, the people who are the assistants or whatever, are not treated with the same kind of respect that's due them by other people in the industry. How did the people in the music industry look upon Mel, and how did they treat him?
Well, Mal was during his lifetime was a pretty powerful guy. He could get to the Beatles. That's still something that I'm sure has
Yeah.
value out there, right? And so Mal was respected. Mal was much beloved by people in the industry. His issue was one that I think is very classic. When you're good at one thing and people know you for that thing. So he was an extremely good roadie. He was an extremely good assistant for artists to have. He knew how to fix things. He could be a fixer in all the meanings of that word. He may not have been as physical as he looked, but he was tough in terms of being of tough-mindedness. The issue, though, is once you've decided in your mind's eye that this guy is the gopher, this guy is the fixer, this guy is the roadie, it's hard to imagine them as anything else. And I ran across several people, including at Apple, who would admit to typecasting him in that way. And that became
Yeah.
very difficult when he had that opportunity to be part of the more upper management echelon at Apple, is they needed him, wanted him in the other role back in the studio. For example, when they were making the White Album, which was a bit of a production totaling more than 1,000 hours. So typecasting is always a problem for folks like that who may have other ambitions.
During the production in the beginning of Sergeant Pepper, because people, if you can picture in your mind the cover of Sergeant Pepper, it's a pretty fascinating collage of pictures. He was responsible for researching a lot of those pictures, was he not?
That's right. As they would put it together, he and his colleague Neil Aspinall would they'd run out. Fortunately, they lived in the town with the British Library, which helps. And they would do a lot of research about the folks whom they were depicting. Of course, many of them would have to sign releases because they were alive, and the Beatles knew that they had a big target on their backs then and now. And they needed to have those conversations. So Mal and Neil were very much a part of that. There was also simply the working in the studio, where he worked with particularly Jan Haworth, who was one of the big visionaries behind the cover, and her husband, Peter Blake.
Mm-hmm. During the maturation process, if you can call it that, of the Beatles, they went through a lot of different changes, as everybody does as you're maturing. I mean, the Beatles were young guys when they first started. What kind of changes were unsettling to him? Was the beginning of the drug introduction of drugs to the Beatles something that Mal had a difficult time with?
It's interesting. He could be conservative politically, as we saw, and I reported in the book. But, in terms of social liberties and those sorts of things, he was extremely permissive and progressive. So when they started, I mean, he was there when they first tried pot. and he very much facilitated their usage and was often responsible for it. Same thing with acid. So none of those things really shook him. Probably the intensity of the change in the 60s, the social change, was more challenging for him to weather because he had already made very conventional choices, had a wife and 2 kids by the end of the decade. So that was probably more unsettling for him personally than anything that ever went on with the band.
Right. And all the different changes that the band went through. I mean, when they started off, we can remember visually the Beatles when they appeared on Ed Sullivan, they were all in their tight black suits, and then suddenly the Nehru jackets came into play, and then the wild psychedelic shirts and everything. That was all part and parcel of the maturation process of the Beatles, and as well Mal as well.
That's absolutely right. So any of those shifts that they went through, Mal went through too, right? And he definitely developed and shifted across those years in much the same way. In fact, when you study his image across the years, you can see it changing very consistently with theirs.
You're saying that he was, he eventually got married and he raised children. And the foreword for the book, by the way, we're talking to Kenneth Womack, who is the author of Living the Beatles Legend, The Untold Story of Mal Evans. And the foreword is written by Mal's son, Gary, who's another imposing figure as well. I saw an interview that the two of you did together. And he talks about how the fact that, his father was away a lot, right? And that can cause friction between, parents and their children. He said, but I love my father dearly, and he tried as hard as he could to get back and spend as much time with us as he possibly could.
That's right. And, in Gary's words really is much of the tragedy of Mal Evans, certainly in his last days. He absolutely compartmentalized his life. There was the family compartment. Then there was the, obviously the compartment belonging to the Beatles, which eventually splits into multiple compartments that Mal is having to nurture and respond to. And that just left little, sometimes no time for his family. As much as they loved him, and his wife waited until, literally the end of Mal's life to ever make any noise about a divorce, and they never were divorced. As much as they loved him, Mal had committed just about every infraction you can in a marriage and in family life. And as I once said to Gary, I'm looking over the whole of this guy's life, and your dad, when it came to Beatles versus family never, ever wins.
Ted Woloshyn returns in a moment.
Attention all men, it'll soon be Black Friday, the absolute best time to restock your wardrobe. Hey, it's Ted Woloshyn for Tom's Place. It's always important to dress for success, and we have you covered from business casual to sports jackets to suits. Incredible deals starting now on lips and shirts, regularly up to $225 each for only $60. S. Cohn and other designer suits, regularly up to $650, slashed to $350, or an amazing 2 for $600. Plus, a huge selection of sports jackets, valued at up to $695, now 50% off. On the second floor, we're also slashing prices on suits, sports jackets, dress shirts, and pants. Check out our website, toms-place.com, for details and more great deals. Tom's Place Black Friday sale, starting now in the heart of Kensington Market, 190 Baldwin. That's Tom's Place, where we'll suit you. Have you been tasked with the role of a state executor, or expected maybe in the future you will be? Well, if so, let me make your life a lot simpler by introducing you to my friend Debbie Stanley. Debbie is the founder of ETP Canada. They specialize in estate administration. Their goal simply is to help Canadian executors understand their role and how to deal with the loved one's estate. Let's face it, there's no school for this, but ETP Canada offers services such as executor support, estate accounting, and they have a new online course called Executor Ready. It's an engaging video designed to make estate administration easier and affordable. And those are two comforting thoughts during a stressful time. So call Debbie Stanley at 1-866 309-0387. That's 1-866-309-0387. Or you can get her at info@etpcanada.ca. That's info@etpcanada.ca.
Now back to Ted Wallachin.
Gary was 14 when his dad died in 76. How much did Gary understand when he was growing up who his dad was working for and with, and how large of a factor they were in pop culture?
To him, as he likes to say, they were my dad's mates.
Yeah.
And I think that has a lot to say there. That's really who they were to him. They were his dad's buddies, and not that he's trying to mitigate who they were or anything of that sort. It's just he understood that was his dad's job. All the kids' dads had jobs. This just happened to be his. Gary might have shown off more about his famous connections if he hadn't come down from Liverpool down to London and experienced, which was very common then, and I hope less so now, but he experienced some kind of regional bias against the Northerners with their funny Scouse accents, and he was very reluctant to share anything about his life because of that reason.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about the Apple years and the beginning of Apple Records, and Mal's role in that, and what his role might have been as had his life continued as Apple went through all the different changes.
Yeah, well, the great news is Apple does continue, and I think
Yeah.
about this question all the time. That Mal Mal would be enjoying the fruits of his labors and his many years with the Beatles if he just hung on. It was
Yeah.
about to get better. The partnership ended when John signed it in the dissolution agreement at Disney World in December '74. It was ratified by the High Court in January or February of 1975. All the pieces were still in place, including the piece involving Mal. He and Neil were still being paid. Neil was in the last weeks of Mal's life, and told him so, was working on, they weren't going to get the band back together in terms of the Beatles, but they were redefining what Apple would be so that it would serve, the guys, right, in their solo careers, and leave them with potential space to collaborate in the future. So I just I get a little sad sometimes when I think about this, because Mal could be enjoying exactly what's happening right now
Yeah.
if he could have just hung on. But of course, that's easy for me to say, or anybody to say. These were mental health issues that were being untreated, and as we know that's insidious. What happens in those situations, and unfortunately, that just left Mal vulnerable and unable to move forward.
As the Beatles became more and more popular until they got to a point where, to paraphrase John Lennon, they were better known than Jesus. How did that make Mel feel in terms of his role? Did he feel that his importance was rising at the same pace that their importance was?
I don't know that he even had time to think about that.
Okay.
His job was so busy. He didn't get breaks. And my gosh, he really, what I think he found is, as things move forward, he was just constantly busy. He felt valued by them, which was very important, and adored by them. They'd have lots of conversations, but he didn't feel any kind of jealousy. I mean, their success was really the result of hard work by folks like him and George Martin and Neil Aspinall, and when he was alive, Brian Epstein. So, the goal was for them to become superstars.
Yeah. I guess one of the things that must have blown him away, like it did everybody watching, and I'm sure the Beatles themselves, was their first appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, but of course he was he was backstage when that was
Yeah.
happening. But the idea of having success like that in the United States at that point was unheard of, right? Nobody thought a British act could break the big American megaplex of fame. It seemed ridiculous that a Liverpool act would do that. They'd been rejected all year by their subsidiary, by EMI's subsidiary Capitol Records. So when they act today like well, we were engineering this thing, they had no idea that it was about
Okay. There's a great picture in the book. There's a lot of great shots in the book of Mel literally putting Ringo's Ludwig drum set together on stage, and it took me back to I think 1964, 65, when the Beatles were appearing here in Toronto at Maple Leaf Gardens, the old hockey arena, and I went down as a young kid to see the show on the Saturday afternoon, and the band The Circle was the opening act, and they finished playing, and then the lights went off, and then few minutes pass, and then suddenly this guy comes walking on stage, wheeling on Ringo's drums. And from that moment until the Beatles left the stage an hour later or whatever, I heard nothing but screaming
that.
because the sound systems weren't as sophisticated as they are now, where you could pick up lyrics and understand what people were saying. It was nothing but young girls screaming. And it took me back when I looked at that picture and I thought, yeah, I can vividly remember that the Beatles drum kit coming on the stage, and that was it.
Yeah,
It must
and
have been.
it
No,
must
go
have been.
ahead.
No, you go ahead. It's your show, pal.
I don't know. No, no, no. It's your book. I was it brought back so many memories when I saw that, and I thought when these things first started happening, when they went from playing the Cavern to having hits to playing a Shea Stadium, places like that. I mean, that would bowl over the average person for sure. I mean, how do you suck that in? How do you take all that in and still remain even keeled?
I don't know
But
that
he
you
managed
can.
to do that.
Yeah, I don't know that. I mean, I don't think he did completely, or maybe in any of the ways that mattered. It was our good friend Larry Kane, of course, who traveled with the band in '64 and '65, who said to me, my gosh, you go on the road with these guys, and you think you know the world a certain way, but suddenly it gets warped very quickly, right? And there's no doubt that it became warped very quickly for Mal Evans, who followed suit in terms of lapping up, all the benefits of fame. I think we're lucky that the technology was lagging behind the Beatles in terms of stadium amplification, because if they'd been successful in that arena, they might have stayed on the road longer. And the most brilliant moment in retrospect of their career was canceling touring for any foreseeable future. That allowed them to make their masterworks.
Yeah, and wasn't it really there? They brought upon the demise of the touring by being the great studio musicians that they were, because they were so inventive. I mean, laying tracks over tracks over tracks. They were doing things in the studio that you couldn't replicate on stage.
Yeah, and this is when you think about them in retrospect, for pretty young guys, they were very good. And if they are genius, and I use that term loosely, this is the moment. Realizing that their talents were better used in the studio than they ever could have been being on the road was really smart. Because what they did was they came in, and as good as they already were in 1966, they just exploded in terms of musicianship, recording artistry, songwriting, really every metric that mattered. From Sergeant Pepper through Abbey Road is conquered. What a remarkable period. And again, it's absolutely remarkable that they realized that they needed to get off the road, which was counterintuitive at the time.
Now, I wonder how we talk about what would have been of Mal Evans had he continued, and we touched briefly on his situation with Apple Records and the fact that he was a producer and a songwriter and an artist and all these different things, and how he could have grown and built what they call a brand today of himself, and he could have established his own empire.
Yeah, I think that's possible. It's one of those issues that we'll never know. Um, but even in 1975, 1976, the last moments of Mal's life, some of the things we understand now and take for granted about that industry have just changed so precipitously, don't you think? I mean, in a lot of
Yeah.
ways, we're back where we were when bands had to go on the road to make their money, right? Now we're sort of back in that place, whereas the Beatles ushered in a very long period of success based on residuals and, selling, vinyl bits of plastic.
Yeah, exactly. So, because it used to be a time where you would go on the road to promote your album, and now you release an album so that you can sell tickets on the road.
That's right. It's the driver's really been reversed.
Yeah. And how would he have handled that? How would he? What would he have thought about the state of the music industry and touring and all the other aspects of the industry today?
Well, Mal was really good at rolling with the changes. I think he would have been okay with some things. I think one thing he would like, and I certainly do, being an English and a music professor, I think a lot about authorship and what that means as being a composer or writer. And I think Mal would have liked the way now we acknowledge everybody's performance. We acknowledge all contributions to a song. You look at a song today and it might have 11 contributors, right? It might have main contributors, but it'll have 11. I think that Mal would have enjoyed the fact that recognition comes in different ways these days. Again, not that he was ever jealous of them, but we all want our mark on this planet to matter, and I think that was important to Mal. Um, he was pretty good at shifting, though. I think he would have understood. Mal liked being on the road, by the way. The Beatles didn't, and their wishes were his command. But Mal
Hmm.
loved being out there, and as I'm sure you remember from the book, as soon as he got out with the Plastic Ono Band in September 1969, he thought, "Wow, let's do this."
Well, it's easier for him to be on the road than it was for them because he could walk out of the hotel room and walk down the street,
That's
whereas
right. Well,
all they
that's
would see of Chicago or New York was opening up the blinds and when they landed, and then you're in a van and you're off to the hotel and you're in the servants' entrance and you're in your room, and then the next thing you're at the arena, and the next thing you're back at the airport. So you can say that you went to 60 countries and 55 cities, but you really saw none of any of them.
that's right. It's not much better than just changing planes at an airport.
Yeah, really. But he at least had the freedom of waltzing around and
He did.
experiencing
He
parts
also
of the
liked,
culture.
he loved hanging out with the guys. It was like going to camp, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Or
yeah.
or a circus, as Depeche Mode would call it.
Oftentimes, people refer to Pete Best, the original drummer, as the fifth Beatle, and sometimes it's George Martin as the fifth Beatle. An argument could be made that Mal Evans was the fifth Beatle.
Well, I do believe that Mal and Neil are probably the only two people who can claim that because there were only two employees of Beatles and Company. And those two guys were Mal and Neil.
Yeah.
So I guess in a way they're the only people. They're the fifth and sixth Beatle, or they're tied for fifth, or something. I mean, they're the only employees that the Beatle and Company had.
Yeah.
So they had a deal, of course, with Brian Epstein for a while, and later with Mr. Klein. But they were the two employees. So if there's anybody who contributes to the band, it's got to be George Martin. If we don't have this music, there's nothing being talked about right now.
Right. Right.
It's
Right.
just because we could talk. I mean, there are far more interesting road bands that went through all sorts of shenanigans we could talk about, Led Zeppelin, The Who, etc. But we're talking about the Beatles because their music will eclipse the centuries, if not the millennia. And so when I come down to anybody else being at all necessary to their success, it's George. I mean, without him, if they get any other producer who tries to just mold them into the pop of the moment, they're dead.
Hmm.
But instead, they get the one guy who wants the brass ring like nobody's ever seen it before. He was primed
Right.
and ready. He wanted success, and he wanted to do something innovative. And here come these guys that are just like, clay he can mold magically into what they would become.
Did Mal's son Gary ever take any interest in the music industry after his father passed?
No, he really didn't. Gary is a really smart guy. He would have a career with, I guess, essentially the British government and become a cartographer. Really shrewd, very smart, great with numbers and dates, etc. That probably wouldn't have been his vocation. Uh, but in so many other ways, he's a lot like his dad.
Mal knew that the end was coming for the Beatles because the arguments began and the disagreements and the camps began to split, and yet he never really got himself in between any of those and sided with anyone. He managed to stay neutral throughout that whole thing, or at least that's the impression I got from the book.
Yeah, he didn't have a dog in that hunt. He wanted everybody to
Yeah.
be friends and to be happy. He would occasionally, his ego would get involved and he would test himself and check himself and sort of remove his ego from the equation. For a while, he sort of clandestinely worked for Paul even after the breakup. But, once it became clear that Mr. McCartney had to be on one side and the other three on the other to make that dissolution happen, Paul couldn't be using Mal anymore. I mean, that would be hypocritical of him to say, I need to sue to get out of this country, but I'm using one of his chief resources. I mean, that just doesn't
That's
work.
very
You can
funny.
almost imagine the Eastman saying, Paul, you're going to have to give up Mal.
Yeah, exactly. Again, it is a fascinating book about a fascinating gentleman, and probably the greatest. Well, I hate saying this because I get into that Stones versus Beatles argument, but I think the Beatles had a bigger impact in popular music than the Rolling Stones did.
Sure. And look, the Rolling Stones are magnificent. Those
Yeah,
albums
for sure.
from Beggar's Banquet to Exile on Main Street, that's one of the greatest runs in the history of any art. But they're going to be second fiddle when people have to make artistic distinctions in the future, which they do, right? They're going to, when you do those sorts of things, you have to look at the totality of the career. And the Beatles are the ones, like it or not, that go from Love Me Do to Abbey Road in the space of 7 years, with each album either matching or succeeding its predecessor. And they end with the greatest swan song in history, Abbey Road, with the song The End.
Yeah.
That is, you can't compete with that. Nobody can. If Billy Bob Thornton said that to me, he was here on campus recently and we were talking Beatles. He's a huge Beatles guy. And he said, if you're a performer and you're hoping for commercial and critical success, you're never beating that. It's not going to happen. Nobody has such a stranglehold over both of those areas of concern, and the Beatles do. And
what's really quite fascinating is you've got a generation now. Like, my kids didn't grow up listening to the Beatles until they were a little older. My kids are in their mid late 30s now, and my son is a musician and a big fan of the Beatles. And
and
there's
if
not
you
a lot of bands who can say that.
That's right. And if you like, I teach a class of 20 students tonight. We're doing Magical Mystery Tour, and they don't take convincing. I get in there and we play the songs, and they're already lip syncing with the lyrics. They know the tunes. They're going to always be like us, no matter what generation you are. They're going to have heard the songs in some format, maybe YouTube, maybe Spotify. I'm sure the things we don't even know about yet that are coming our way. And that will be how they consume and discover music. But the Beatles are always going to be discoverable. And, whether you're 10 right now or 60 right now, if you hear Help and it's the first time, you're going to think, damn, where did that energetic and majestic song come from?
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't sound like anything else.
And on top of that, to take a song that became so popular and turn it into a film, which was a huge success at box office.
Sure, but it's the music that's going to out. The music will be. John Lennon said that in one of his last interviews, that you can worry about reunions or talk about the old days. That's fine, he said. But the only thing that's going to matter in the future, and you've already got access to it, he said, is the music. And he was damn right.
Yeah. Living the Beatles Legend, The Untold Story of Mal Evans by Kenneth Womack. The foreword is written by Mal's son, Gary Evans. If you're a Beatles fan or a fan of popular culture or just a fan of history, you got to pick up this book. It's outstanding. I thank you so much for your time, Ken.
Oh, thank you, Ted. Much appreciated.
Well, that's going to do it for us for another episode. Thanks very much for tuning in. Pick up a copy of the book if you're interested in the interview, because it really is quite fascinating. There's some great illustrations and pictures and a lot more than what you got on this interview inside that book. In the meantime, drop by our website, www.tedwoloshin, WOLOSHYN. Let us know what you think. Any questions, any comments, any suggestions for future guests, all appreciated. And you can go back and listen to every single podcast that we have recorded in these 2+ years that we've been doing this. And there's also links to our sponsors. And thanks to our sponsors, Tom's Place and ETP Canada. And don't forget, when you're online, fill out your organ and tissue donation card. You could change or even save a life. In the meantime, have a great week.
The Ted Woloshyn Podcast has been brought to you by Tom's Place. For the finest in men's clothing at unbeatable prices, it's Tom's Place at 190 Baldwin in the heart of Kensington Market. Tom's Place will suit you. And ETP Canada, providing estate administration with ease. The Ted Woloshyn Podcast is produced by me, Becky Coles. Technical production by Paul Gatt. Music by Bike Thieves. For more information on this podcast and our sponsors, and to talk to Ted, go to www.tedwoloshyn.ca.